I'm 61 years old, and for 37 years I've carried two secrets. The first one I shared with only one living being. The second one is what that being did with the trust I gave her, and it's something that still wakes me up at night, wondering if I made the right choice all those years ago. Her name was Sage, at least that's what I called her. She was a Bigfoot, a female, and I met her in the spring of 1984 when I was 24 years old, hiding in the mountains of Northern California, trying to disappear from a life I'd left behind. I told her something I'd never told another human being. A secret so painful, I'd built an entire new existence around keeping it buried. And she listened. She understood. And years later, when my past came looking for me, she made a choice based on that trust, a choice that haunts both of us. This is the story of how a woman running from her biggest mistake found family in the most impossible place, and how love, even between species, can break your heart in ways you never imagined. Spring of 1984 arrived in Siskiyou County with late snow and the smell of wet pine. I was 24 years old, living in a cabin so remote it didn't appear on any map, working under a name that wasn't mine, cleaning vacation rentals in the small mountain towns for cash. My real name was Charlotte Webb, but I'd left Charlotte behind in Sacramento 8 months earlier. Up here, I was Annie Cole, and Annie Cole had no history, no family, no past that could reach out and destroy the fragile peace I'd built in the wilderness. I told myself I was being careful, but really, I was hiding from the worst decision I'd ever made. My cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that turned to mud every time it rained, about 40 minutes from the nearest town of Etna. No electricity, just a propane stove and kerosene lamps, no phone. The isolation was deliberate. I'd found the place through a handwritten ad on a bulletin board at the general store, a seasonal hunting cabin that the owner was willing to rent year-round for almost nothing, because most people couldn't handle the solitude. I'd signed the lease with my new name, paid 3 months in cash, and moved in with 2 duffel bags containing everything I owned. My days followed a numbing routine. Wake before dawn, drive into town or one of the smaller mountain communities, clean whatever rentals were on my schedule. Scrub toilets, change sheets, vacuum pine needles from carpets while tourists slept in or hiked or did whatever people did when they came to the mountains for vacation. Then, I'd drive back to my cabin, heat up something simple on the propane stove, and sit on my porch watching the light fade behind the ridgeline. Some nights I'd read by kerosene lamp, old paperbacks I found at thrift stores. Most nights I just sat in the dark and tried not to think. But the thing about running away is that you can't outrun your own mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. The hospital room with its fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell. The way her fingers had curled around mine, so small and perfect. The sound of her breathing, soft and steady, the only thing in the world that had ever felt completely right. And then the papers, the signatures. The social worker with kind eyes telling me I was making a brave choice, that I was giving her a better life than I could provide at 23, broke, alone, terrified. I'd believed them because I'd wanted to, because I was scared and had no idea what I was doing. Because the baby's father had disappeared the moment I told him I was pregnant, and my own family had made it clear I was on my own. So I'd signed. I'd let them take her, and then I'd gotten in my car and driven north until Sacramento was just a name on a map, until Charlotte Webb was someone I used to be, someone I could pretend had died giving birth and left me behind to figure out how to live with what she'd done. The mountains were supposed to help. The silence, the space, the distance from everything and everyone. But silence just meant there was nothing to drown out the voice in my head, asking the same question over and over. What kind of mother gives her baby away and then runs? I didn't know then that within 3 weeks I'd find something in these mountains that would finally make me feel less alone. Something that would listen to the truth I couldn't tell another human being. Something that would become the only family I'd allow myself to have. I didn't know that the isolation I'd chosen as punishment would become the place where I'd finally learn what it meant to be trusted, to be seen, to be forgiven. All I knew in that spring of 1984 was that I was 24 years old, and I was living under someone else's name. And the person I used to be was a ghost I carried with me everywhere I went. It happened on April 19th, 1984, a Thursday afternoon when I'd finished cleaning a rental cabin near the Marble Mountain Wilderness. I was hiking back to my truck along an old logging road, surrounded by Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, when I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up. Not a bear grunt, not an elk call, something else entirely. A vocalization that sounded almost human, but wasn't. Resonant and low, coming from somewhere in the dense forest to my left. I froze, my hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on my belt, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then I saw her. She was standing between two massive cedars about 50 yards away, partially obscured by shadow and undergrowth, but visible enough that there was no mistaking what I was looking at. At first, my brain tried desperately to rationalize it. A person in dark clothing, a bear standing upright, a trick of the light and shadow. But as my eyes adjusted and she shifted her weight slightly, every rational explanation crumbled. She was enormous, at least 7.5 feet tall, maybe more, with shoulders so broad they made the tree trunks beside her look narrow. Her body was covered in fur, reddish-brown like autumn leaves, longer around the shoulders and head, shorter on the arms, and she was watching me. Not with animal curiosity, not with predatory focus, but with something else. Something that looked almost like recognition, or maybe assessment. My mouth went dry. Every wilderness safety protocol I'd ever learned suddenly felt inadequate, irrelevant. This wasn't in any guidebook. This wasn't supposed to exist. My father had spent 30 years photographing wildlife, had shown me pictures of every creature that lived in the American wilderness, and this wasn't in any of his books. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and sprint back to my truck, but I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my whole body locked in place by a mixture of terror and something else I couldn't quite name. Wonder, maybe, or disbelief so profound it had paralyzed me. We stood there, maybe 30 seconds, maybe 3 minutes. I honestly couldn't tell you. Time felt distorted, stretched. She didn't move toward me, didn't make any aggressive gestures. She just stood there, partially hidden, observing. I could see her chest rising and falling with breath. Could see the way her hands hung at her sides, massive but somehow not threatening. And I could see her face, though not clearly in the shadows. Dark eyes that caught the filtered afternoon light, a broad, flat nose, features that were both human and not human, familiar and completely alien. Then, with a movement so swift and fluid it seemed impossible for something so large, she turned and disappeared into the forest. I heard the sound of heavy footfalls, branches breaking, the noise growing fainter as she moved away. And then there was just silence. The normal sounds of the forest, birds, wind in the trees, slowly returning as if they'd been holding their breath too. I stood there shaking for what felt like forever before my legs would cooperate enough to walk. When I finally made it back to my truck, I sat behind the wheel with the doors locked, staring at nothing, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined it, if isolation and guilt had finally broken something in my brain. But I knew what I'd seen, and more than that, I knew what I'd felt in that moment of eye contact. She'd seen me, really seen me, not Annie Cole, the fake identity with the manufactured past, not even Charlotte Webb, the woman who'd given her baby away, just me. A human being standing in the forest, as out of place and hidden as she was. For the first time in 8 months, I didn't feel invisible. I felt witnessed, and I had no idea what to do with that. For 3 weeks after that first sighting, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, that massive figure covered in reddish-brown fur, watching me from between the trees with eyes that held something I recognized. Caution, yes, but also intelligence, maybe even curiosity. I'd grown up in Sacramento, a city girl through and through. But my father had been a wildlife photographer and had taught me to observe, to notice, to respect the natural world. And what I'd seen wasn't in any nature book I'd ever read. She shouldn't exist, and yet she did, living in these mountains, probably watching humans like me stumble through her territory every day. I started carrying a notebook with me on my cleaning jobs, sketching what I remembered during lunch breaks. The shape of her shoulders, the way she'd stood with her weight on one leg, the length of her arms. I drew her face over and over, trying to capture the expression I'd seen in those brief moments before she'd vanished. My sketches were rough, amateurish, but they helped me process what had happened, made it feel real instead of like some stress-induced hallucination. At night, sitting alone in my cabin with the kerosene lamp flickering, I'd pull out my father's old field guides that I'd kept when I left Sacramento. Grizzly bears, black bears, elk, mountain lions, nothing matched. I drove to the library in Eureka one Saturday, spent hours in the reference section reading about Pacific Northwest wildlife, indigenous legends, and yes, even the fringe materials about Bigfoot sightings. Most of it was obviously sensationalized, blurry photos and obvious hoaxes, but some of the Native American accounts felt different. The Karuk people had stories about the upriver people, beings who lived in the deep forests and avoided human contact. They weren't monsters in those stories. They were just another people trying to survive, wanting to be left alone. I kept telling myself to let it go, to forget what I'd seen and focus on my own survival, my own hiding. Getting curious, getting involved, that was dangerous. What if I saw her again and someone else was around? What if I accidentally led people to her? The last thing I needed was attention, questions, people looking too closely at Annie Cole and discovering she wasn't who she claimed to be. But I couldn't stop. Because the truth was, I hadn't felt afraid in those moments when we'd looked at each other. Startled, yes. Shocked, absolutely. But not afraid. And there was something else, something I was only beginning to understand. She was hiding too. Living in the shadows, avoiding detection, existing in a world that would destroy her if it knew she was real. Just like me. Maybe that's why I started hiking longer routes after work, taking trails that wound closer to where I'd seen her. Maybe that's why I found myself stopping at clearings, sitting quietly, waiting, hoping. I told myself I just wanted to see her again, to confirm she was real. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I was lonely, not just isolated, but profoundly, achingly lonely in a way I'd never experienced before Sacramento. I'd cut myself off from everyone, from family who'd rejected me, from friends who'd known Charlotte, from any possibility of connection because connection meant risk, meant exposure, meant someone might see through the careful lies I'd built. But she'd already seen me, and she hadn't run. She'd just watched, assessed, decided I wasn't a threat, and left. No judgment, no questions, no expectations. I didn't know it then, but I was already making a choice. The distance between fear and curiosity is shorter than you'd think. And once you cross it, once you decide that understanding something matters more than protecting yourself from it, there's no going back. I was about to cross that line, and it would change everything. By mid-May, I'd started varying my routes deliberately, taking longer hikes after work, hoping to catch another glimpse. I felt half crazy, like I was searching for proof that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. On a cool Thursday evening, the sun already dropping behind the ridgeline, I decided to try something that felt both brave and incredibly stupid. I'd stopped at a clearing where I'd seen broken branches and unusual tracks, signs that something large had been foraging for food. I sat down on a fallen log, pulled an orange from my backpack, and placed it on a flat rock about 15 feet away. Then I simply waited, not moving, barely breathing, feeling ridiculous and terrified all at once. 20 minutes passed. My legs started to cramp from sitting so still. The evening air grew cooler, raising goosebumps on my arms. I could hear the forest settling into its twilight rhythms, the shift from daybirds to night creatures, the subtle change in the wind. Part of me wanted to give up, grab the orange, and head back to my truck before it got too dark to navigate the trail safely. This was insane. I was sitting alone in the wilderness, trying to bait a creature that probably didn't even exist, that I'd probably hallucinated in a moment of stress and isolation. But I stayed, because the alternative was going back to my empty cabin, to another night of silence and regret, to the weight of everything I was running from. At least, out here. I was doing something, even if it was crazy. The sun slipped lower, painting the clearing in shades of amber and shadow. I was about to stand up to admit defeat when I heard it. That same low vocalization I'd heard 3 weeks ago. Close, maybe 30 yards away, somewhere in the dense thicket to my right. My heart jumped into my throat. Every muscle in my body tensed, but I forced myself to stay still, to keep breathing, to not run. Movement caught my eye. She emerged from between the trees slowly, cautiously, her massive form moving with surprising quiet through the undergrowth. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, partially concealed by a young fir, watching me the same way she had before, assessing, deciding. I didn't speak, didn't move. Just met her gaze and tried to communicate through stillness that I wasn't a threat, that I was just curious, that I meant her no harm. I don't know if any of that translated, but something must have, because after what felt like an eternity, she took a step forward, then another. She moved toward the rock where I'd placed the orange, but stopped about 10 feet from it, still keeping distance between us. She looked at the orange, then at me, then back at the orange. I could almost see her thinking, processing. Was this a trap? What did this strange human want? I held my breath, afraid that any movement would break whatever fragile moment this was. Then she did something I never expected. She reached down, and I realized for the first time that she'd been carrying something, a handful of wild strawberries, small and red and perfect. She placed them carefully on the ground between us, maybe halfway between where I sat and where she stood. Then she backed up a few steps. My breath caught. She was reciprocating. I'd offered food and she was offering food in return, not taking without giving, not accepting charity, establishing something equal, something mutual. Quote 1, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Quote 2. She watched me for another long moment, then moved forward quickly, grabbed the orange with one massive hand, and retreated back toward the tree line. She didn't eat it immediately. Instead, she held it up to her face, smelling it, examining it with what looked like genuine curiosity. Then she looked at me one more time, and I swear I saw something in her eyes that looked almost like acknowledgement, maybe even approval. She turned and disappeared into the darkening forest. I heard her moving away, the sound of branches and footfalls fading until there was nothing but the evening wind and my own ragged breathing. I sat there until full darkness fell, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. When I finally stood on shaking legs and walked over to where she'd left the strawberries, I picked one up and ate it. It was sweet and perfect, still warm from her hand. That night, driving home in the dark, I understood something fundamental. This wasn't just about proving she existed or satisfying curiosity. This was the beginning of something I'd never had before. Communication without words, trust without history, connection without judgment. For the first time since I'd signed those papers in Sacramento, I didn't feel completely alone. And that terrified me almost as much as it gave me hope. Summer arrived, and with it came a pattern I'd never expected. Every 4 or 5 days, I'd return to that clearing, always in the late afternoon when the light turned golden and the forest grew quiet. I'd bring food, apples, berries I'd picked, sometimes bread or dried fish from the general store. And she'd come, not every time, but often enough that I began to understand she was choosing to see me. We didn't have words, but we were developing something else, a system of gestures, vocalizations that I learned to recognize, a way of being in each other's presence that felt almost like conversation. She'd touch a tree trunk, then touch her chest, showing me territory, identity, home. I'd mirror the gesture, showing her I understood, that I respected the boundaries she was teaching me. I started carrying a separate notebook just for our meetings, documenting every gesture, every sound, every interaction like my father used to document wildlife behavior. But this felt different from scientific observation. This felt personal. She wasn't just a subject to study. She was someone I was learning to know. By late June, I could recognize 3 distinct vocalizations. There was the low, resonant sound she made when she first arrived, a kind of announcement or greeting. A softer, almost musical series of sounds that seemed to indicate contentment or approval, usually when she examined the food I'd brought. and a sharper, quieter sound, almost a huff, that I learned meant caution or warning, usually when she'd heard something in the forest that made her nervous. She seemed to be learning me too. She'd watch how I moved, how I positioned myself, the sounds I made. Once, when I arrived at the clearing with a twisted ankle from a fall earlier that day, limping badly, she noticed immediately. She made that soft, concerned sound and approached closer than she ever had before, maybe 12 feet away, studying my leg with clear interest. I pointed to my ankle, made a face that I hoped conveyed pain, and she nodded. Actually nodded. It was such a human gesture that it startled me, made me wonder how much time she'd spent watching humans, learning our body language. I told her, even though I knew she probably didn't understand the words. Just clumsy. She made a soft sound, then disappeared into the forest. I thought maybe I'd scared her off with my injury, that she'd decided I was too vulnerable or unpredictable. But she came back 10 minutes later carrying something. Leaves. Big, broad leaves that I recognized as common plantain, a plant my father had shown me years ago that had mild anti-inflammatory properties. She placed them near my feet, then backed away, watching to see what I'd do. I picked them up, my hands shaking, and pressed them against my ankle through my sock. Quote 5. I whispered. Quote 6. That was the moment I started thinking of her as Sage, not just as quote 7 or quote 80, but as someone with a name, even if only in my mind. The gesture felt too much like care, like concern for another being, to treat her as anything less than a person. Over the following weeks, our language expanded. I learned that when she pointed toward the mountains, she was showing me where she went when she wasn't here, her deeper territory. When she made a sweeping gesture with both arms, she was talking about the whole forest, the bigger picture. When she touched her chest and then gestured toward me, she was acknowledging our connection, this strange relationship we were building. I taught her things too. Showed her how to open the simple latches on the plastic containers I sometimes brought food in. Demonstrated that I could make different sounds mean different things, trying to show her the concept of words even if she couldn't speak them. Once, I brought a small mirror from my truck, and when she saw her own reflection, she made a sound I'd never heard before, something between surprise and recognition. She touched the mirror, then her own face, then looked at me as if asking, "Is that me?" But the most important thing we learned had nothing to do with gestures or sounds. It was something quieter, something that happened in the spaces between our meetings. I learned that I could trust her to show up, to honor this pattern we'd created. And she learned, I think, that I wasn't going to bring anyone else, wasn't going to expose her, wasn't going to be like whatever humans had taught her to hide from in the first place. We were teaching each other a language that no one else would ever understand. A private code built on observation and patience, and the simple act of showing up again and again, choosing to see each other when the rest of the world was determined to look away. I drove home those evenings feeling something I hadn't felt in over a year. Not happiness exactly, but something close. Purpose, maybe. Or connection. The crushing loneliness that had followed me from Sacramento was still there, but it had company now. It had someone who saw me, even if that someone was covered in reddish-brown fur and lived in the shadows of the Marble Mountain wilderness. I didn't know it then, but I was preparing to tell her everything. To share the secret that had driven me into these mountains. To trust someone, even if that someone wasn't human, with the truth of who I really was. By the fall of 1984, I'd been living as Annie Cole for just over a year, and Charlotte Webb felt like someone who died and left me behind to pick up the pieces. I worked, I hiked, I met with Sage, as I'd begun calling her in my mind, because her fur had that sage green tint in certain light, and the rest of my life felt hollow, performative. The woman who cleaned cabins and smiled at tourists and said she'd moved here for the peace and quiet, that wasn't really me. She was a shell I inhabited to keep Charlotte's past from catching up. And the only time I felt real, truly myself, was in those hours in the forest with a creature who shouldn't exist, who asked nothing of me except presence and honesty. The lies had become automatic. At the general store in Etna, the clerk would ask how I was settling in, and I'd say, quote, 10, quote, when the woman who hired me for cleaning jobs asked about my family, I'd say, oh, they're back east, we don't talk much. Simple lies, easy lies, the kind that rolled off my tongue without effort because I'd practiced them so many times. But each one felt like another layer of distance between who I was and who I was pretending to be. One Saturday in early October, I ran into a woman named Beth at the post office. She was maybe 40, friendly, owned a small bookstore in town. We'd chatted a few times before, surface-level stuff about the weather and the tourists. But that day, she smiled and said, hey, a few of us are getting together for dinner next Friday at my place. Nothing fancy, just some locals. You should come. I should have felt grateful. An invitation to connect, to make friends, to build a life in this community. Instead, I felt panic rising in my chest, because going to dinner meant more questions, more lies, more opportunities for someone to look too closely at Annie Cole and see the cracks in the story. That's really kind, I said, forcing a smile. But I've got a job up near Sawyer's Bar that day. Rain check? Sure, Beth said, her smile dimming just slightly. Let me know if you change your mind. I left the post office feeling sick to my stomach. This was my life now. Pushing people away, maintaining distance, turning down kindness because kindness meant risk. I drove straight to the clearing where I met Sage, even though it wasn't our usual day, because I couldn't stand being Annie Cole for one more minute. Sage wasn't there when I arrived, but I sat down on our usual log and waited, my hands shaking, tears burning behind my eyes. 20 minutes later, I heard her approach through the forest. She emerged from the trees and stopped when she saw me, her head tilting slightly. She made a soft, questioning sound. Something was wrong, she could tell. Quote 17, I said aloud, knowing she couldn't understand the words but needing to say them anyway. I'm so tired of lying, of being someone I'm not, of hiding. She moved closer than usual, maybe 8 feet away, and sat down on the forest floor. Just sat there, massive and solid and real, watching me with those dark, intelligent eyes. She made another soft sound, and somehow I knew what it meant. I'm listening, and that's when I realized Sage was the only being in the world who knew me without lies. She didn't know my name, didn't know my history, didn't know anything about Annie Cole or Charlotte Webb. She just knew me. The person who showed up in the clearing every few days, the person who brought apples and sat quietly and tried to communicate across a divide that shouldn't be crossable, the person who was scared and lonely and hiding, just like her. With Sage, I didn't have to perform, didn't have to remember which version of my past I'd told to which person, didn't have to smile when I didn't feel like smiling or pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. I could just be. And she accepted that, whoever that was. I have a secret, I told her quietly. Something I've never told anyone, something that made me run away from my whole life. She made a soft sound, almost like acknowledgement. And I understood something in that moment that I'd been avoiding for months. I wanted to tell her, needed to tell her, because carrying this alone was destroying me, and there was no one else in the world I trusted enough to share it with. Not because she was safe, because she couldn't tell anyone, but because she'd already seen me at my most vulnerable, my most uncertain, my most real. And she'd kept coming back. I didn't tell her that day. I wasn't ready yet. But driving home through the autumn dusk, I knew it was coming. The unburdening, the confession. The moment when I'd finally speak the truth aloud and trust that it wouldn't destroy me. Living as two people was slowly killing me. But maybe, just maybe, I could be one person with Sage. Maybe that would be enough to survive. It was late October when I realized I wanted to tell her. Not just show her things or share space, but tell her my real story, the one that had driven me into these mountains in the first place. I didn't know if she could understand human speech, but I'd seen enough intelligence in her eyes, enough response to my tone and inflection to believe that maybe somehow she'd understand the weight of what I needed to say. I arrived at our clearing on a gray afternoon, the air thick with the promise of rain, and she was already there, sitting on her usual fallen log, waiting. I sat across from her, my hands shaking, and I started to talk. Not about the weather or the forest, but about Charlotte, about the person I used to be. I began, my voice barely above a whisper. Sage tilted her head slightly, that gesture I'd come to recognize as attention, focus. She made a soft sound, encouraging, or maybe just acknowledging that I was speaking differently than usual. My throat felt tight, but I kept going. 2 years ago, when I was 23, I got pregnant. The father, he left the moment I told him, just disappeared. And my parents, they said I'd brought shame on the family, that I needed to figure it out on my own. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling the chill of the October air, or maybe just the chill of remembering. I didn't have money for an apartment, couldn't afford daycare, could barely afford to feed myself, and everyone kept telling me the same thing, that I should give her up for adoption, that it was the responsible choice. The first drops of rain began to fall, soft and cold on my face. Sage didn't move, just sat there, watching me with those impossibly deep eyes. I said, and my voice broke on the words. Tears were streaming down my face now, mixing with the rain. I'd never said any of this aloud before. Never admitted to another living soul what I'd done. My breath was coming in ragged gasps now. The rain was falling harder now, soaking through my jacket, plastering my hair to my face. Sage stood slowly and moved closer, maybe 6 feet away, closer than she'd ever been. She made a sound I'd never heard before, low and mournful, resonant with something that sounded almost like grief. I whispered, "Quote 30. I looked up at her through the rain. Quote 31. Sage stood there for a long moment, rain running off her fur in rivulets. Then she did something that made my breath catch. She placed one massive hand over her chest, over her heart, and made that soft, mournful sound again. Then she touched a nearby cedar tree. The gesture we'd established for home, for identity. Then she touched her chest again. She was telling me something, about herself, about loss, about understanding. I don't know how long we sat there in the rain, this strange pair, a woman who'd run from her past and a creature who lived in the shadows. But when Sage finally turned to leave, she looked back once, and in her eyes I saw something that felt like acceptance, not judgment, not pity, just understanding. I drove home soaking wet and shivering, but lighter somehow. The secret I'd carried alone for 2 years was finally shared. And the person I'd shared it with, the only person in the world who knew the truth, had looked at me and chosen not to turn away. That night, lying in my cabin listening to the rain on the roof, I realized something. Sage had secrets too. She lived hidden, avoided humans, existed in a world that would destroy her if it knew she was real. Maybe that's why she understood. Maybe that's why she didn't judge. We were both running from something. Both carrying weight we couldn't put down, both finding in each other something we desperately needed, someone who could see us and not look away. My real name is Charlotte Webb, I said, my voice cracking on the first syllable. I'm 25 years old, and 2 years ago, when I was 23, I gave birth to a baby girl in a hospital in Sacramento. She weighed 7 pounds, 4 ounces. She had dark hair and the smallest fingernails I'd ever seen. And I held her for 6 hours before I signed the papers that gave her away to someone else. Sage didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched me with those deep dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything I was saying. The rain started then, soft drops that pattered on the leaves above us, and I kept talking, the words pouring out like they had been dammed up inside me for 2 years, poisoning everything they touched. Quote 32. I said, and saying her name out loud for the first time felt like breaking open a wound I'd tried to stitch closed. Not officially. The adoption agency said the new parents would name her, but in those 6 hours, I called her Lily. I told her I loved her. I told her I was sorry. I told her things I'll never get to tell her again. The rain was coming down harder now, cold and relentless, but I couldn't stop, couldn't hold it back anymore. Everyone said I was doing the right thing, The social worker, the counselor, even the nurses, they said I was giving her opportunities, that I was being selfless, that adoption was an act of love. I wiped rain and tears from my face with shaking hands, but it didn't feel like love. It felt like tearing out my own heart and handing it to strangers and hoping they'd take better care of it than I could. Sage made a sound then, soft and low, something that vibrated through the clearing. Not a question, more like recognition. Like she understood pain that couldn't be put into words. I continued, my voice barely audible over the rain. I looked down at my hands, at the way they were trembling. These hands had held her, had supported her tiny head, felt her fingers wrap around my thumb with surprising strength, and then these same hands had signed papers that said I was giving up all parental rights, that I would never see her again, that legally, she would never be mine, I said. Sage shifted slightly, moving just a bit closer, maybe 5 feet away now, close enough that I could see individual strands of fur plastered to her face by rain, could see the way her eyes never left mine. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering now, though I wasn't sure if it was from cold or from finally speaking the truth. But you can't outrun guilt, I whispered. You can't change your name and pretend you didn't do what you did. Every day I wake up and wonder if she's okay. If the people who adopted her are kind, if she's happy, if she'll ever wonder about me. And every day I hate myself a little more for not being strong enough to keep her. Sage stood then, her massive form rising slowly. She took a step toward me, then another, until she was close enough that I could have reached out and touched her if I had dared. She placed one enormous hand over her chest, over her heart, and made that deep, mournful sound again. Then she reached out, slowly, carefully, and touched the tree beside me, our gesture for home and identity. But then she did something new. She touched the tree, then touched her chest, then made a cradling gesture with her arms, and suddenly I understood. She was telling me about loss, about home, about something she'd once held and no longer had. You lost someone too, I said, my voice breaking. Didn't you? She made a sound that could only be described as grief made audible. And in that moment, sitting in the rain with a creature that shouldn't exist, I felt less alone than I had in 2 years. We stayed like that until the rain began to ease, two beings who'd both lost something they could never get back, who'd both learned to live in the shadows of that loss. When Sage finally turned to leave, she looked back once and made a soft sound, gentler than before. It felt like understanding, like acceptance, like forgiveness I'd never thought I'd receive. I drove home that evening with my clothes soaked through and my body shaking from cold, but something had shifted. The secret wasn't gone, the guilt wasn't erased, but it wasn't locked inside me anymore, growing toxic in the darkness. Someone knew, someone had listened, someone had looked at the worst thing I'd ever done and hadn't turned away in disgust. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough to keep breathing, enough to keep going, enough to believe that maybe one day I could forgive myself for the choice I'd made in that hospital room 2 years ago. She didn't judge me. That was the thing that broke me, sitting there in the rain, tears streaming down my face as I told this impossible creature about the worst thing I'd ever done. She didn't leave, didn't turn away, didn't make any gesture that suggested I was wrong or broken or unforgivable. Instead, after I'd finally gone quiet, my voice hoarse from crying, she did something I'll never forget. She stood slowly, moved closer than she'd ever come before, maybe 8 feet away, and she placed one massive hand over her own chest, over her heart. Then she made a sound, low and mournful, that echoed through the trees like grief itself had found a voice. She understood loss. She understood the pain of separation, of choices that couldn't be undone. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, droplets falling from the pine needles above us like tears from the forest itself. I wiped my face with my sleeve, trying to pull myself together, but Sage wasn't finished communicating. She sat back down on the forest floor, her movements deliberate and slow, and began to show me something. She made that cradling gesture again, arms curved as if holding something small and precious. Then she rocked slightly, the way you'd rock a baby to sleep. My breath caught. She was showing me she'd had a child, or maybe more than one, I whispered. She made a soft affirmative sound, then her expression shifted. Her hands moved in ways I'd never seen before, gestures that seemed frantic, desperate, running maybe, or fleeing. Then she made a harsh, sharp sound that could only represent violence or danger. Her whole body tensed with the memory of it. I watched, my heart breaking, as she showed me through gesture and sound what had happened. Humans. She kept pointing in the direction of where roads cut through the mountains, where towns sat at the forest's edge. Humans had come. She showed me hiding, showed me separation, showed me searching and not finding. Then she placed both hands over her chest and made that mournful sound again, deeper this time, older. A grief that had lived in her body for years. Quote 46, I said, understanding flooding through me. Quote 47. She nodded, that gesture she'd learned from watching me, and the simple human movement from this massive, fur-covered being shattered something in my chest. We'd both lost our children. We'd both made choices or had choices forced upon us that we couldn't take back. We'd both been living with that loss, carrying it through our days, letting it shape everything we did. I'm so sorry, I said, my voice breaking again. I'm so sorry. Sage moved closer still, close enough now that I could smell the pine and earth scent of her fur, could feel the warmth radiating from her massive body despite the rain. She reached out slowly, giving me time to move away if I wanted to, and gently touched my shoulder with one enormous hand. The touch was light, careful, like she was afraid of hurting me, but it was also firm enough to feel real, solid, grounding. We stayed like that for a long moment, two mothers who'd lost their children, connected across species by the universal language of grief. She didn't try to tell me it would be okay. She didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. She just acknowledged that the pain was real, that the loss was real, that we were both carrying something heavy that we couldn't put down. When she finally pulled her hand back, she made a series of soft sounds, almost like a lullaby. Then she touched her chest and gestured toward me, then toward the forest around us. I think she was saying that we had each other now, that we'd both lost family, but maybe we could be something like family to each other. Not a replacement for what we'd lost, but something new, something that could exist alongside the grief. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. She made one more sound, gentle and low, then turned and walked back into the forest. But before she disappeared into the trees, she looked back and touched her chest one more time, then pointed to me. A promise, maybe, or a commitment. We were connected now in a way that went beyond our afternoon meetings and food exchanges. Driving home that evening, my hands were steady on the wheel for the first time in weeks. The guilt was still there. The loss was still there. But it felt different now, shared instead of solitary. Sage had looked at the darkest part of me and recognized it because she carried darkness too. And somehow, in that recognition, there was a kind of healing. I'd spent 2 years trying to run from my pain, trying to bury it under a new name and a new life. But Sage had taught me something in that clearing. You don't heal by running. You heal by being seen, by finding someone who understands what it means to lose something you can never get back and choosing to keep living anyway. We were both survivors of our own stories, both carrying grief that would never fully go away. But maybe together, we could carry it a little better. Maybe that was enough. From 1985 through 1992, 7 years passed in a strange kind of suspended reality. Charlotte Webb stayed buried, Annie Cole continued her quiet life in the mountains, and Sage became the only constant I trusted. I watched her through seasons and years, learned her patterns, her territory, the signs that told me she was near even when I couldn't see her. And she watched me too, I think, making sure I was safe, that the isolation I'd chosen wasn't destroying me. Sometimes she'd leave things for me to find, stones with interesting patterns, feathers, once a perfect robin's egg that somehow hadn't broken. Gifts that said, I see you, I'm here, you're not alone. Our meetings settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Every 4 or 5 days, I'd drive to the clearing in the late afternoon. And more often than not, she'd be there, sometimes waiting, sometimes arriving a few minutes after me, announcing her presence with that low, resonant sound I'd come to recognize as greeting. I'd bring food, she'd bring gifts, and we'd sit together in companionable silence, communicating in the language we'd built together. I turned 26, then 28, then 30. My life stayed small and contained. I cleaned cabins, paid my rent in cash, kept to myself. Beth from the bookstore stopped inviting me to things after the third or fourth polite refusal. People in town started calling me, quote, 50, quote, I had acquaintances but no friends except for Sage, and somehow that was enough. In the spring of 1987, I arrived at our clearing to find a gift that made me cry. Sage had left a cluster of wildflowers, carefully arranged with a smooth stone placed in the center. It was March 14th, Lily's birthday. Her 5th birthday. I'd told Sage the date once, months earlier, pointing to a calendar and trying to explain through gesture what the day meant. She'd remembered. This creature who supposedly didn't have language or culture or the ability to understand human concepts had remembered the birthday of a child she'd never met, a child I'd lost and had left me flowers. I sat in that clearing and sobbed until I couldn't breathe. When Sage emerged from the trees, she didn't come close. She just stood at the edge of the clearing, watching, her presence saying, I know today is hard. I'm here. By 1989, I could read her moods as easily as I could read the weather. I knew when she was content from the way she moved, relaxed and unhurried. I knew when she was nervous, when her head would swivel toward sounds I couldn't hear, when she'd make that quiet huffing sound that meant caution. And I knew when she was sad, when she'd sit very still and make that mournful sound that spoke of old grief that never quite healed. Those were the days I stayed longer, sometimes until the light failed completely. I talked to her about nothing and everything, about the tourists who left trash in the forest, about the deer I'd seen on the drive up, about the way the seasons were changing. I don't think she understood the words, but she understood the tone. The offering of company in the face of loneliness. She did the same for me. On the anniversary of the day I'd given Lily away, Sage would somehow know. She'd appear at the clearing with food instead of me bringing it, reversing our usual pattern. Berries or fish or, once memorably, a perfect honeycomb still dripping with honey. Taking care of me the way I usually took care of her. The years marked themselves in small ways. The winter of 1990 brought the heaviest snow I'd seen in the mountains, and I worried about Sage constantly. I'd hike through 2 feet of powder to our clearing, leaving supplies, not knowing if she'd find them. She always did. And she'd leave tracks in return, large prints in the fresh snow, a way of saying, I'm okay, still here. By 1991, I was 33 years old, and Lily would be 9. Old enough to read chapter books, old enough to have friends and maybe play soccer or take piano lessons. I wondered about her constantly, but had trained myself not to search, not to try to find out who'd adopted her. That door was closed. I'd closed it myself when I signed those papers, but I had Sage. And in those 7 years, she became more than just the creature I met in the forest. She became my family. The only being in the world who knew the truth of who I was and chose, again and again, to show up anyway, to leave me gifts, to sit with me in silence, to remember the days that mattered and mark them with flowers or perfect stones or her simple presence. I learned her patterns so well I could predict where she'd be on any given day based on the season and the weather. I learned to recognize the changes in her fur as years passed, the slight graying around her muzzle, the way she moved just a bit slower in winter. She was aging, just like me. We were both getting older together, both carrying our losses through time, both finding ways to keep living despite the weight. One evening in August of 1992, I was hiking back to my truck after a meeting with Sage when I realized something that stopped me in my tracks. I'd been meeting with her for 8 years, 8 years of consistent, careful friendship, 8 years of trust being built and maintained. I'd kept this secret longer than I'd kept any other secret in my life, longer than I'd hidden my pregnancy, longer than I'd lived as Annie Cole before telling her the truth. This relationship, this impossible connection with a being that shouldn't exist, had become the most stable, most honest thing in my life. And I realized, standing there in the fading light with pine needles crunching under my boots, that I would protect it with everything I had. Would protect her with everything I had. Because she'd protected me. For 8 years, she'd given me a reason to keep going, given me someone to show up for, given me proof that I was capable of loyalty and love and commitment, even if I'd failed at it once before. I didn't know then that our family was about to grow. That within a year, Sage would trust me with something even more precious than her own safety. But walking back to my truck that evening, I felt something close to peace. Not happiness, not healing, but peace. The kind that comes from knowing you're not alone, that someone sees you, that you matter to at least one being in this vast and different world. And sometimes, that's enough to survive on. In the spring of 1993, everything changed. I arrived at our meeting spot to find Sage there, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, partially hidden in the shadows of the undergrowth, was a smaller figure, maybe 6 feet tall, covered in darker brown fur. Young, I realized immediately, watching the way it moved with adolescent awkwardness, the way it stayed close to Sage's side. She'd had a child, or perhaps adopted one, I couldn't know. But the way she positioned herself between me and the young one, protective but not aggressive, told me everything about what this meant to her. She was showing me her family, trusting me with the most vulnerable thing she had. Just as I'd trusted her with mine. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the weight of what I was witnessing. Sage made a soft sound, different from her usual greeting, gentler. Then she turned her head slightly toward the young one and made another sound, almost like encouragement or reassurance. The young one peeked around Sage's massive frame, and I got my first clear look. Dark brown fur, almost black in the dappled sunlight. Eyes that were curious but cautious, watching me the way children watch strangers, trying to decide if I was safe. The face was softer than Sage's, rounder, still growing into its features, maybe 12 or 13 years old if I had to guess, though I had no real way of knowing how their aging worked. Quote 50 Wawan. I said softly, keeping my voice low and non-threatening. Quote 52. Sage made that soft sound again, and the young one took a tentative step forward, still mostly concealed behind her. I could see now that it was nervous, one hand gripping Sage's arm, the other curled into a fist against its chest. This was terrifying for them, I realized, showing a young one to a human. Trusting that I wouldn't hurt them, wouldn't tell anyone, wouldn't bring danger to the most precious thing Sage had. I sat down slowly on the log where I usually sat, making myself smaller, less threatening. I pulled an apple from my bag and placed it on the ground between us, then pushed it gently forward with my foot. Not toward them exactly, just offering it, letting them decide. Sage watched me for a long moment, then made a series of soft vocalizations to the young one. Teaching sounds. I thought, instructions or explanations. The young one listened, its head tilting slightly, then looked at me again, this time with less fear and more curiosity. Quote 53. I said to Sage, my voice thick with emotion. Quote 54. Sage touched her chest, then made that cradling gesture she'd shown me years ago when she told me about her loss. But this time, instead of ending with grief, she pointed to the young one and made a sound that could only be described as joy, love, pride. Tears blurred my vision. I was happy for her, genuinely, deeply happy. But I was also devastated because watching her with her child made me think of Lily, who would be 11 now, almost the same age as this young one, who I would never see, never hold, never watch grow up. Sage had gotten a second chance at motherhood. I never would. The young one finally moved closer. Drawn by curiosity, or maybe by Sage's encouragement, it crept forward, grabbed the apple quickly, and scurried back to Sage's side. Then, it held the apple up to its nose, smelling it the way Sage had done years ago when I'd first offered her one. Learning from its mother, being taught. You're doing such a good job, I whispered, not sure if I was talking to Sage or to myself. "You're taking care of them, keeping them safe, teaching them." Sage made a soft sound and did something that broke my heart wide open. She placed her hand over her chest, then gestured toward the young one, then toward me. She was showing me that we were connected now, all three of us, that her family and my trust in her had created something bigger than just our two-person meetings in the clearing. Over the next hour, I watched as Sage taught the young one about me, how to recognize my scent, how to interpret my movements, which sounds I made meant different things. She was teaching her child that not all humans were dangerous, that some could be trusted, that I was safe. And in doing so, she was giving me a gift I'd never expected, a chance to be part of a family again, even if that family looked nothing like anything I'd imagined. When they finally left, disappearing into the forest together, I sat in the clearing and cried. For Sage's loss and her healing. For my own loss that would never heal. For the young one who would grow up knowing at least one human who wished them only safety and happiness. For the impossible beauty of being trusted with something so precious. Driving home that evening, I realized something profound. Sage had built a family after losing one. She'd survived her grief and found a way to love again, to protect again, to mother again, despite the risk and the fear and the memory of what she'd lost before. And if she could do that, maybe there was hope for me too. Not hope that I'd ever see Lily again, but hope that I could learn to live with my grief instead of just running from it. Hope that I was capable of love and loyalty and commitment, even if the form it took was strange and unexpected. Sage had shown me her family because she trusted me. And in that trust, she'd given me something to hold on to. A reason to keep showing up. A reminder that family didn't always look the way you expected it to, but it could still be real, still be meaningful, still be worth protecting with everything you had. That night, I added a new entry in my journal, the private one I kept locked in my cabin. Sage has a child. She's a mother again. And somehow, impossibly, I'm part of their family now. Not a parent, not a guardian, but something. Someone who matters, someone who's trusted. It wasn't enough to heal the wound of losing Lily. Nothing would ever be enough for that. But it was something. And after 9 years of carrying that loss alone, something was more than I dared to hope for. Over the next 3 years, I watched that young Bigfoot grow from an awkward adolescent into a graceful, confident being. Sage brought him. I determined it was male by his size and build to our meetings more frequently, teaching him what she'd learned about humans, about which ones could be trusted and which ones couldn't. I'd see the way she guided him, corrected him when he got too curious or too bold, the way she'd make soft vocalizations that were clearly instructions or warnings. And I understood, watching her parent with such fierce devotion, exactly what I'd given up. The weight of my choice settled over me again, fresh and sharp as the day I'd signed those papers. But Sage never made me feel judged. If anything, her presence seemed to say that motherhood came in many forms, that love could exist even in absence. I started thinking of the young one as Cedar, after the trees where I'd first seen him hiding behind Sage. He grew quickly, adding inches every few months, his movements becoming more coordinated and purposeful. By the summer of 1994, he was nearly as tall as Sage, though still leaner, still growing into his frame. One afternoon in August, I watched Sage teach Cedar how to identify edible plants. She'd pick something, hold it up, make a specific sound. Then she'd let him smell it, examine it, and try to find another one himself. When he brought her the wrong plant, she'd make a different sound, firmer, and show him the difference. Patient, but insistent. Teaching him survival skills that could mean the difference between life and death. I sat on my log, tears streaming silently down my face, because I would never teach Lily anything, would never show her which berries were safe to eat, or how to tie her shoes, or how to sound out difficult words in books. Someone else was teaching her those things. Someone else was watching her grow, watching her learn, watching her become whoever she was going to be. Quote, 58. I said quietly to Sage during one of our meetings that fall. Cedar was off exploring the creek, still within view, but giving us space. Quote 59. Sage made a soft sound, acknowledging. She moved closer and did something she rarely did anymore. She touched my shoulder. That same gentle gesture she'd made years ago when I first told her about Lily. Her massive hand rested there for just a moment, warm and solid and real. By 1995, Cedar had become comfortable enough with me to approach on his own, without Sage standing guard. He'd take food directly from my hands, his movements careful, almost gentle despite his size. Once, when I arrived at the clearing with a cut on my hand from catching it on a fence, Cedar noticed immediately. He made a concerned sound and looked to Sage, who examined my hand from a distance and then sent Cedar to fetch something. He came back with moss and those same plantain leaves Sage had brought me years ago. Healing plants. He'd learned from watching her care for me. And now he was doing it himself. I pressed the plants against the cut, my hands shaking, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Thank you, Cedar," I whispered. "You're such a good kid." Sage made a sound that I'd learned meant pride, satisfaction. She was proud of him, this young one she'd raised, who was learning to be gentle and careful and kind, who was learning that not all humans were threats. One evening in the spring of 1996, I watched Cedar practice climbing, moving from tree to tree with increasing confidence while Sage watched from below, ready to intervene if needed. He was showing off a little, I thought, testing his abilities, pushing boundaries the way teenagers do. And Sage was letting him, but staying close, staying vigilant. It was such a familiar dynamic, parent and teenager, the push for independence, the need for safety. The balance between letting go and holding on. I watched them and felt something crack open in my chest, something that had been frozen for 14 years. This is what I gave up, I thought, not just the baby in the hospital, but this. The years of watching someone grow, the privilege of teaching them how to be in the world. The fierce protectiveness that never really goes away, even when they get bigger and stronger and think they don't need you anymore. I told Sage quietly after Cedar had finished his climbing display and gone off to explore. Quote 63. Sage looked at me with those deep, knowing eyes, and I saw understanding there. She knew what it cost me to watch her parent, to see what I'd never have with Lily. But she also seemed to be telling me something else. That being here, bearing witness, being part of their lives even from a distance, that meant something too. That there were different ways to love, different ways to be present in someone's life. I thought about Lily constantly during those 3 years. Wondered if her adoptive parents were as devoted as Sage was to Cedar. Wondered if they watched her with pride when she learned something new, if they corrected her gently when she made mistakes, if they made her feel safe and loved and seen. I hoped they did. I prayed they did, even though I'd stopped believing in prayer years ago. But watching Sage with Cedar also taught me something unexpected. It taught me that I was capable of witnessing love without possessing it, that I could be happy for someone else's motherhood, even while grieving my own lost chance. That love didn't always mean ownership or control or even proximity. Sometimes love meant just showing up, being steady, being there when someone needed you to be there. Sage had shown up for me for 12 years. Had listened to my worst secret and hadn't turned away. Had remembered Lily's birthday every year and left flowers. Had let me be part of her family, even though I'd given mine away. And somehow, impossibly, that mattered. It didn't erase what I'd lost. It didn't make the grief go away. But it reminded me that I was still capable of connection, still capable of being trusted, still capable of being present for someone, even if I'd failed at it once before. By the summer of 1996, Cedar was confident enough to meet me alone sometimes, though never far from where Sage waited in the trees. He'd take food from me, show me things he'd found, once even tried to teach me his vocalizations, making sounds and waiting for me to copy them back. I was terrible at it. My human vocal cords not designed for the resonance he could produce, but he was patient with me, the way a teenager might be patient with an adult who's trying to understand their world. One afternoon, as I was leaving the clearing, I looked back and saw them together. Sage with her hand on Cedar's shoulder, both of them watching me go. a mother and her son, a family. And I was part of that family now, in my own strange way. Not a parent, not a sibling, but something. Someone who mattered to them, someone they trusted. Driving home that evening, I realized that I'd been given a gift I never expected. Not motherhood in the traditional sense, but witness to it, permission to see and be seen. A chance to understand that the choices we make, even the ones that break us, don't have to be the end of our story. Sage had lost a child and found another, had survived her grief and learned to love again. And maybe, just maybe, I could learn to do the same, not by finding another child, but by learning that I was still capable of showing up, of being trusted, of being part of something bigger than my own pain. It wasn't enough, it would never be enough, but it was something. And sometimes, something is all you get. Summer of 1996 brought tourists and backpackers in droves, and with them came a man who made my blood run cold the moment I saw him. He was setting up equipment in the forest near my usual trails, cameras with motion sensors, audio recording devices, even what looked like tranquilizer equipment. His truck had University of Oregon plates and a bumper sticker that read, Sasquatch Research Institute. I approached him with a fake smile, asked what he was researching, and he told me, eyes bright with enthusiasm, that he'd been tracking reports of unusual activity in this area for months. He was going to prove they existed. He was going to be the one who finally brought evidence to the world. I left him there and drove straight to Sage's territory, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. He was close, too close, and I had to warn her. His name was Dr. Marcus Webb. No relation to my former name, but the coincidence felt like a sick joke. He was maybe 40, fit, clearly experienced in wilderness work. He'd shown me his equipment with the pride of someone who genuinely believed he was doing important scientific work, contributing to human knowledge. Quote 65. He'd said, pulling out a worn notebook filled with coordinates and timestamps, vocalizations that don't match any known wildlife. Footprints 17 inches long, tree structures that show intelligent manipulation. Something is here, something significant. I'd nodded, kept my expression neutral. Asked innocent questions about his timeline and methods while my mind screamed, danger, danger, danger. He'd be here for at least 2 weeks, he said, had funding from the university and a private wildlife foundation, had permission from the Forest Service to conduct his research. You might want to avoid the eastern trails for a while, he'd said with a friendly smile. Quote 68. The eastern trails. That was Sage's territory. The area where Cedar was still learning to navigate, where they felt safe, where we'd met for 12 years without interference. This man was setting up his research grid right in the heart of their home. I hiked into the forest faster than I'd ever moved before, abandoning the trails for direct routes through the undergrowth. Branches tore at my clothes, my lungs burned, but I didn't slow down. I made the vocalization Sage had taught me years ago, the one that meant urgent, need to meet. I'd only used it twice before, once when I'd seen illegal hunters near her territory, once when a wildfire was spreading and she needed to know which direction to flee. She appeared within 10 minutes, Cedar close behind her. They both looked tense, picking up on my fear immediately. Sage made a questioning sound. Her whole body coiled tight. I said, breathing hard. I pointed in the direction of the eastern trails. Sage went very still. Then she made a sound I'd heard only a few times before, low and warning, almost a growl. Cedar moved closer to her, his eyes wide. He was scared. They both were. I tried to show them what I meant using our gesture language. I mimicked setting up cameras, pointed to my eyes and then to them, showing being watched, being recorded. I made the shape of a cage with my hands, tried to convey capture, danger, exposure. Sage understood. She made a series of sharp vocalizations to Cedar, instructions I couldn't fully interpret, but that clearly meant, be careful, stay hidden, danger, I said desperately. But Sage shook her head, that human gesture she'd learned from me. She touched the trees around us, touched her chest, made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the whole territory. This was her home. She wasn't leaving. She'd already lost one child, already been driven from one place. She was making a stand. I understood it. I respected it, but it terrified me. "Then I'll stop him," I said, the words coming out before I'd fully thought them through. Quote, 75. Sage looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Not just trust, but reliance. She was depending on me. She was trusting me to protect her family the way she'd protected my secrets for 12 years. I drove back to town with my mind racing. What could I do? Sabotage his equipment? That was destruction of property. Report him for something he hadn't done? That was filing a false report. Try to convince him to leave. He had permits, funding, institutional backing. He wasn't going to be persuaded by some random local woman telling him to pack up and go home. But I had to do something. Because if he got his proof, if he published evidence of Sage and Cedar's existence, it wouldn't stop with him. More researchers would come, journalists, photographers, eventually hunters or people who wanted to capture them, study them, turn them into specimens or exhibits or proof of concept. Sage and Cedar would spend the rest of their lives running. Or worse, they wouldn't run fast enough. That night, I sat in my cabin and thought about the person I'd been 14 years ago. Charlotte Webb, who'd been so scared and alone that she'd given away her own daughter, who'd run from responsibility and consequences, who'd chosen safety over everything else. And I thought about the person I'd become. Annie Cole, who'd found family in the most impossible place, who'd been trusted with secrets and had kept them, who showed up again and again, even when it was hard. I'd failed Lily. I'd given her away when she needed me most. But I wasn't going to fail Sage and Cedar, even if it meant breaking laws, even if it meant putting myself at risk, even if it meant finally stepping out of the shadows I'd been hiding in for 13 years and doing something that couldn't be undone. I'd spent more than a decade running from my past, from my choices, from my guilt. But running was over. Now I had to fight. For the family I'd found. For the beings who'd given me a reason to keep living when I thought I had none. Dr. Marcus Webb didn't know it yet, but he'd made a mistake coming to this forest. Because between him and Sage's family stood a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. And I was done being passive, done being scared, done letting other people make decisions about who deserved to exist and who deserved to be safe. This was my line in the dirt, and I wasn't going to let anyone cross it. For weeks, I tracked that researcher, learning his patterns, finding his cameras, and quietly disabling them, leading him away from Sage's territory whenever I could. But he was persistent, intelligent, determined. And then, in late August, he told me he'd found something conclusive, fresh footprints, vocalizations on his audio equipment, hair samples. He was calling in a team. They'd be here in 3 days with more equipment, more people. I have to tell someone, I remember thinking, driving home that night. Someone who could actually do something, who had authority, who could protect this place. But telling anyone meant exposing Sage, meant trusting institutions and bureaucracies with a secret I'd protected for 12 years. That night, I made a decision. I called an anonymous tip line for the Forest Service, reported illegal research activity, falsified permits, disturbing protected wildlife habitats. I lied. And 3 days later, the researcher was escorted out of the forest, his equipment confiscated, his credentials under review. The weeks leading up to that call had been a nightmare. I'd spent every free moment in the forest, sometimes following Dr. Webb at a distance, sometimes rushing ahead to dismantle his cameras or erase evidence before he could collect it. I'd poured water on fresh tracks, moved his audio equipment so it faced the wrong direction, even scattered my own scent around areas where Sage and Cedar had been to confuse any tracking attempts. But he kept getting closer. One morning in mid-August, I found one of his cameras positioned perfectly to capture the trail Sage used most frequently. The motion sensor was state-of-the-art, the kind that wouldn't miss anything. I destroyed it, smashed it with a rock and buried the pieces, my hands shaking the whole time. That was destruction of property. That was a crime. But what choice did I have? 2 days later, Dr. Webb confronted me in town. Quote, 76, he said, his friendly demeanor gone, replaced by suspicion and anger. Quote, 77. I looked him in the eye and lied. Quote, 78. Quote, 79, he said coldly. Quote 80, I shrugged. He's kept my expression innocent, but I knew I was running out of time. He was on to me, or at least suspicious, and he was about to call in reinforcements. The night I made the phone call, I sat in my cabin for 2 hours, the phone in my hand, finger hovering over the buttons. What I was about to do was wrong, not just morally ambiguous, but objectively wrong. I was going to file a false report, accuse someone of crimes they hadn't committed, potentially destroy their career and reputation. Dr. Webb was probably a good person. He believed he was doing important work, contributing to science, solving a mystery. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He just wanted proof. But proof would destroy Sage and Cedar. Once the world knew they existed, there would be no peace, no safety, no quiet life in the forest, just cameras and researchers and eventually cages and laboratories and dissection tables. I thought about Lily, about the choice I'd made 15 years ago when I signed those papers. I'd chosen safety over love, practicality over connection, someone else's judgment over my own instinct. And I'd regretted it every single day since. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. I dialed the number. When the operator answered, I changed my voice slightly, tried to sound older, more authoritative. I need to report illegal research activity in the Marble Mountain Wilderness area, I said. There's a researcher operating without proper permits, using tranquilizer equipment without authorization, disturbing protected habitats. He's also been trespassing on private land. The lies came easily. Too easily. I gave them Dr. Webb's name, his vehicle description, the location of his base camp. I invented violations, fabricated concerns, made it sound urgent and credible. And when they asked for my name, I hung up. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely set the phone down. I just crossed a line I could never uncross. I'd weaponized bureaucracy against someone who was probably just trying to do their job, and I felt sick about it. But I also felt relief, because it would work. I knew it would work. The Forest Service took violations seriously, especially when it came to unauthorized research and potential wildlife disturbance. They'd investigate, find inconsistencies in his paperwork, even if the paperwork was legitimate, and shut him down long enough for Sage and Cedar to disappear deeper into the wilderness if they needed to. 3 days later, I watched from a distance as 2 Forest Service rangers escorted Dr. Webb out of the forest, his equipment loaded into their truck, his face tight with frustration and anger. He was arguing with them, showing them permits, trying to explain. But they weren't listening. Bureaucracy in motion, unstoppable once it started. I felt like I was going to throw up. That evening, I hiked to our meeting spot, not sure if Sage would even come. She appeared after about 20 minutes, Cedar beside her. They both looked tense, alert, ready to run. I could see the toll the past few weeks had taken on them, the constant vigilance, the fear. Quote 84, I said simply. Quote 85. Sage tilted her head, questioning. How? Why? I said. And then, because I'd never lied to her because honesty was the foundation of everything we had, I added, I lied to people in authority, told them he was breaking rules he wasn't breaking. I got him in trouble to protect you. I didn't know if she understood the specifics, but she understood the weight of what I was saying. She moved closer, studying my face, and I knew she could see the guilt there. The knowledge that I'd done something wrong even if it was for the right reasons. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and touched my chest, over my heart, with one massive hand. Then she touched her own chest. Then she gestured to Cedar, to the forest, to everything we'd built together over 12 years. She was telling me that sometimes protecting family meant making hard choices, that sometimes doing the right thing meant doing the wrong thing, that she understood, and she didn't judge me for it. I burst into tears. I'm sorry, I said, not sure if I was apologizing to her or to Dr. Webb or to some abstract concept of morality. I didn't know what else to do. Sage made a soft sound, gentle and reassuring. Then she and Cedar sat with me while I cried, Two impossible beings keeping vigil over a woman who'd just discovered that love makes you capable of things you never thought you'd do. Driving home that night, I understood something fundamental about myself. I'd spent 15 years thinking I was a coward, someone who ran from hard choices, who couldn't be trusted with important decisions. But I just lied to authorities, risked legal consequences, potentially ruined someone's career, all to protect two beings that most people didn't even believe existed. That wasn't cowardice. That was something else entirely. Loyalty, maybe, or love. Or the desperate need to not fail again, to not lose another family, to prove that I was capable of protecting something precious when it mattered most. I'd done something wrong, but I'd also done something right. And I was going to have to learn to live with both of those truths at the same time. The real question was, what else would I be willing to do? What other lines would I cross? How far would I go to keep Sage and Cedar safe? I didn't know the answer yet, but I was starting to suspect that there might not be a line I wouldn't cross, and that terrified me almost as much as losing them did. On September 7th, 1999, a woman knocked on my cabin door. She was 21 years old, tall, with dark hair and a nervous smile. She introduced herself as Emma Webb. She'd been adopted as an infant, she said, voice shaking, and she'd spent the last 3 years searching for her birth mother, a woman named Charlotte Webb who'd last been known to live in Sacramento but had disappeared in 1983. She'd traced utility records, talked to former neighbors, followed a trail of breadcrumbs until it led her here, to Annie Cole, who'd moved to Siskiyou County in 1984, who matched Charlotte Webb's description perfectly. Who was, she said, looking at me with eyes that were my father's eyes, her mother. I stood in that doorway, feeling like the ground had opened beneath me, and I didn't know whether to cry or run or slam the door and pretend this wasn't happening. Quote 90, she said quickly, misreading my frozen silence as rejection. Quote 91. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. She had my father's eyes, the same pale green with gold flecks that I saw every time I looked at old photographs. She had my mother's nose, the slight upturn at the end, and she had something of me in the shape of her face, the way she held her shoulders like she was bracing for disappointment, but hoping anyway. This was Lily, the baby I'd held for 6 hours 17 years ago. The infant with tiny fingernails and dark hair who'd wrapped her hand around my thumb. She was standing on my porch, fully grown, looking at me with hope and fear and 17 years of questions. Quote 92, I managed to whisper. Quote 93. Quote 94, she asked gently. Quote 95. I stepped back mechanically, letting her into the cabin that had been my hiding place for 15 years. She looked around, taking in the sparse furniture, the kerosene lamps, the life I'd built in isolation. If she judged it, she didn't show it. Quote 96, she said, settling carefully onto my worn couch, like she was afraid any sudden movement would make me bolt. Quote 97. I sat across from her, my hands gripping my knees so hard they hurt. Quote 98. Quote 99, she said, and I felt relief and grief crash over me in equal measure. Quote $100. Why I gave you up, the question I'd been asking myself for 17 years, the guilt that had driven me into these mountains and kept me here, isolated and afraid. I was 23, I said, my voice barely audible. I had no money, no support, no idea how to take care of a baby. Your father left the moment I told him I was pregnant. My parents disowned me. Everyone said adoption was the best choice, that I was giving you a better life. Were they right? Emma asked, and there was no accusation in her voice, just genuine curiosity. I looked at this young woman, this impossible gift I'd given away, and tried to answer honestly. Quote, 104. Quote 105, she asked. Quote 106, because I couldn't live with what I'd done. Because every day in Sacramento reminded me of you. Because being Charlotte Webb meant remembering that I was a mother who'd given her child away, and I couldn't bear to be that person anymore. But I didn't say that. Instead, I said, I needed to start over. to be somewhere where no one knew me, where I didn't have to explain or justify or remember every single day. Emma nodded slowly. I understand that, I think. She paused, then said, I'm not here to make you feel guilty. I'm not angry. I just wanted to meet you, to know you if you'll let me. The hope in her voice broke something in my chest. She wanted to know me. After everything, after 17 years, after I'd abandoned her before she could even remember my face, she wanted a relationship, I said, the words tumbling out. Quote 111. Quote 112. Emma said quickly. Quote 113. She pulled out a piece of paper, already prepared, and wrote down her information with hands that shook slightly. She was nervous too. I realized. This was terrifying for both of us, I said as she stood to leave. She looked at me with those familiar eyes, my father's eyes, and smiled sadly. You gave me to people who could love me properly. That's not nothing. We can figure out the rest later. After she left, I sat in my cabin for 2 hours, unable to move, unable to think. Lily was Emma now. She had parents who loved her, a life that had turned out well, and she didn't hate me. She wanted to know me. I should have been overjoyed. Instead, I was terrified, because knowing her meant revealing the truth about who I was, about the life I'd been living, about the secrets I'd been keeping. It meant stepping out of the shadows I'd been hiding in for 15 years. And more than that, it meant risking loss again. What if we built a relationship, and then I disappointed her? What if she learned who I really was and decided I wasn't worth knowing? What if loving her meant losing her all over again? That evening, I drove to Sage's territory in a daze, needing to tell someone, needing to process what had just happened. She appeared quickly, sensing my distress, Cedar close behind her. She found me, I said, my voice cracking. Lily, my daughter, she found me. She's here. She wants to know me. I tried to explain through our gesture language, pointing to myself, making the cradling gesture for baby, showing separation, and then reunion. Sage understood. She made a soft sound, almost like celebration, like she thought this was good news. I don't know what to do, I whispered. I don't know if I can do this. What if I hurt her again? What if I'm not what she needs? Sage moved closer and did something she rarely did anymore. She placed both massive hands on my shoulders and looked directly into my eyes. Then she made a gesture, touching her chest and then gesturing to Cedar. Family? She'd built a family after losing one. She was telling me I could too. But what Sage didn't understand, what I couldn't explain, was that letting Emma into my life meant risking everything. The identity I'd built, the secrets I'd kept, the fragile peace I'd found in these mountains. I left the forest that night with no answers, just more questions and a phone number burning a hole in my pocket. Emma Webb, Lily, my daughter, waiting for me to decide if I was brave enough to be her mother again, even in some small way. I had 3 days before I had to decide, 3 days to figure out if I could take the risk, 3 days before everything changed again. But I didn't know then what Sage would do with the information I'd shared. Didn't know that she'd see Emma as a threat, not a gift. Didn't know that her attempt to protect me would destroy the one chance I'd ever have to know my daughter. I didn't know that the trust I'd built over 15 years was about to break both of us in ways we'd never recover from. I told Emma I needed time, a few days to process this, to figure out what to say, how to explain 15 years of silence. She gave me her number, the name of the motel where she was staying. I'll wait, she said gently. I've waited this long. Take the time you need. After she left, I drove straight into the forest, hiked to Sage's territory, my mind churning with fear and guilt and a desperate clawing need for guidance. I found her near the creek where we'd first exchanged food all those years ago, and I told her everything, about Emma, about the choice I was facing, about whether I had any right to step back into a life I'd abandoned. Sage listened, made soft sounds of understanding, and then she did something strange. She moved toward me, closer than she'd been in years, and she touched her chest, then pointed toward where the main road cut through the forest. She was telling me something, but I didn't understand, not until it was too late. I'd sat with Sage for over an hour that day, talking through my fears and confusion. I'd tried to explain Emma through our gesture language, showing the cradling motion for baby, then showing growth, showing separation, and then reunion. I'd pointed toward town, toward where Emma was staying, and I must have communicated my anxiety because Sage had become very still, very focused. She'd made sounds I couldn't quite interpret, gestures that seemed almost agitated. She kept touching her chest, then pointing toward the road, then making a warding motion with her hands. At the time, I thought she was asking if Emma was a threat to me emotionally, if reconnecting would hurt me the way the original separation had. I'd told her honestly, I don't know if I can handle this. What if I let her in and then I fail her again? What if she learns who I really am and decides I'm not worth knowing? Sage had made that mournful sound, the one that meant understanding of pain. Then she'd done something she'd only done a handful of times in 15 years. She'd embraced me, her massive arms wrapping around me carefully, holding me while I cried against fur that smelled like pine and earth and wild places. I'd left that meeting feeling somewhat better, like I'd been heard and understood. I drove home planning to call Emma the next day, to invite her over, to start the difficult process of building a relationship with the daughter I'd given away. But I never made that call. The next morning, I woke to pounding on my door. It was Pete, who owned the general store in town, his face tight with concern. "Annie, you know that girl who came through asking about you? The one from Sacramento?" My stomach dropped. "Emma, what about her?" "She's in the hospital in Eureka. Found her yesterday evening on one of the hiking trails, completely hysterical. Couldn't speak coherently, kept talking about something impossible in the woods. They're saying it might be a psychotic break, but..." He paused, looked uncomfortable. "Some of the things she said about something huge in the forest. Something that shouldn't exist. I thought you should know." I barely remember driving to the hospital. My hands shook on the steering wheel, my mind refusing to accept what my gut already knew. When I got there, they wouldn't let me see her. "Family only," the nurse said. Her parents were flying in from Sacramento, would be here by evening. Quote 127. I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The nurse looked at me with professional sympathy. Quote 128. But I knew it wasn't a bear. I knew exactly what she'd encountered. I drove to the forest in a fog of denial and dawning horror, hiked to our usual meeting spot with legs that felt like lead. Sage was there, and the moment I saw her, I knew. She looked agitated, distressed, making sounds that indicated she'd done something she thought was necessary, but that had upset her. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Emma, the young woman I told you about. What did you do to her?" Sage made a series of gestures. She showed searching, pointed toward town, showed someone asking questions. Then she showed herself revealing, showed fear, showed driving away. She'd seen Emma in the forest, asking questions, showing people a photo, my old photo from Sacramento. And Sage had seen exactly what I'd trained her to see over 15 years. A threat. Someone looking for Charlotte Webb, someone who could expose me, destroy the identity I'd built, bring danger to both of us. She'd protected me. The only way she knew how, by revealing herself to Emma, by terrifying her so badly she couldn't speak, by driving her away from the mountains and away from me. Quote Part 1. I breathed, sinking to my knees. Quote 32. Sage made a confused, distressed sound. She thought she was protecting me. I told her for 15 years that Charlotte Webb needed to stay hidden, that discovery would destroy everything. I told her humans were dangerous, that exposure meant loss. I'd reinforced that when I'd driven away Dr. Webb. I'd taught her that protecting our secret meant driving away anyone who got too close to the truth, and she'd learned her lesson perfectly. She just wanted to know me, I said, tears streaming down my face. She wasn't going to hurt anyone. She just wanted a relationship with her birth mother, and you terrified her so badly she can't even speak. Sage moved toward me, making soft, apologetic sounds. She reached out to touch my shoulder the way she had so many times before, offering comfort, but I pulled away. "Don't," I said, my voice breaking. Don't touch me. You destroyed the only chance I had to know her, the only chance to be her mother in any real way. And I can't even be angry at you because I did this. I taught you this. I made you think that anyone looking for Charlotte was dangerous. I stood up, backing away from Sage, watching her massive form shrink somehow, her shoulders sagging with distress and confusion. Cedar appeared at the edge of the clearing, drawn by the sound of our anguish, looking between us with clear concern. I have to go, I said. I have to. I don't know. Figure out how to fix this, if it can even be fixed. I left them there and drove back to the hospital. Emma's parents had arrived by then, a couple in their 50s who looked exhausted and terrified. I approached them in the waiting room, my heart hammering. Quote, T9, I said quietly. Quote, 140. Emma's mother looked at me with eyes full of pain and anger. You're the one she was looking for, the birth mother who didn't want to be found. The words hit like a physical blow. That's not... I did want to see her. I was going to call her today. I just needed time to process. Well, you took too long, her father said harshly. Now our daughter is traumatized, can't speak, keeps drawing pictures of monsters. The doctors say she may never fully recover from whatever happened to her in those woods. I'm sorry, I whispered. I'm so sorry. Your apology doesn't help her, Emma's mother said. Quote 148. They turned away from me, and I understood that I'd lost her, not just for now, but forever. Emma's parents would never let me near her again. And even if they did, what could I say? How could I explain that a creature from legend had terrified her because I'd taught it to protect my secrets at all costs? I drove home in a haze of grief and guilt. That night, I went back to the forest, but not to see Sage. I went to scream at the trees, to rage at myself, to finally acknowledge the full weight of what I'd done. I'd given Lily away 17 years ago because I thought someone else could be a better mother. And when she'd come back, when she'd given me a second chance I didn't deserve, I'd destroyed it. Not directly, but through the consequences of 15 years of hiding, of teaching someone I loved to protect me by driving away anyone who got too close. Sage had done exactly what I'd taught her, and in doing so, she'd broken both of us. Because now she had to live with the knowledge that protecting me had hurt me more than any threat ever could, and I had to live with the knowledge that my fear and secrecy had cost me my daughter twice. Once by my own hand, and once by the hand of the only family I'd allowed myself to have. The next day, I tried to see Emma one more time before her parents took her back to Sacramento, but they had security turn me away at her hospital room. Through the small window in the door, I caught a glimpse of her. She was awake, staring at the ceiling, her eyes empty in a way that made my chest ache. She wasn't the hopeful, nervous young woman who'd knocked on my door. She was broken, and I had broken her. I didn't go back to see Sage for 3 weeks. Couldn't face her, couldn't face what we'd done to each other. When I finally hiked to our meeting spot, she was there, waiting. She looked thinner, her fur less glossy, her eyes haunted. Cedar was with her, staying close like he was worried about her. We looked at each other across the clearing, two mothers who'd lost their children in different ways, who'd tried to protect each other and had only caused more pain. I sat down on our log. After a moment, Sage sat too. We didn't exchange food. Didn't make gestures or sounds. We just sat together in the weight of what we'd done, what we'd lost, what we could never get back. Finally, I spoke. Quote, 149. Sage made that mournful sound, deeper and more wrenching than I'd ever heard it. She touched her chest, then made the cradling gesture, then pointed toward where the road led to town. She was apologizing. She understood now that she'd hurt someone I loved, someone who was supposed to be safe, I said. I looked at Sage, at this being who'd been my only family for 15 years, who'd listened to my secrets and kept them, who'd protected me and loved me in her own way, and I realized something that made me want to scream. Love wasn't enough. Trust wasn't enough. Because when you taught someone that the world was dangerous, when you built a relationship on hiding and fear and protecting secrets at all costs, eventually that fear would destroy the very things you were trying to protect. We sat together until dark. When I finally stood to leave, Sage made a questioning sound. Would I come back? I don't know, I said honestly. I need time to figure out if I can forgive either of us for this. I walked away, leaving her in the gathering darkness. And for the first time in 15 years, I didn't know if I'd ever come back. Emma never made it to our second meeting. 3 days after she knocked on my door, I got a call from the county sheriff. A young woman matching Emma's description had been found unconscious on a hiking trail, suffering from what appeared to be a severe fright response, possible psychological break. She was hospitalized, couldn't speak coherently, kept talking about something impossible in the woods, something that shouldn't exist. And I knew. I knew immediately what had happened. Sage had seen Emma searching the forest, asking questions in town, showing my old photo to locals. She'd seen a threat. Someone who could expose me, destroy the identity I'd built. She'd seen someone hunting Charlotte Webb, and she'd protected me the only way she knew how. She'd revealed herself to Emma, terrified her into silence, driven her away. She'd done exactly what I'd asked her to do 12 years earlier when I told her my secret, when I told her I needed to disappear. She'd protected me, and in doing so, she'd cost me the only chance I'd ever have to know my daughter. I stood in the hospital hallway, watching through a small window as Emma's adoptive parents held her hands, talking to her gently while she stared at nothing. The doctor said she kept drawing the same thing over and over, a massive figure in the trees, dark eyes watching her. She'd been hiking near Marble Mountain, they said, probably got lost, got scared, and her mind broke under the stress. They were talking about psychiatric medication, trauma therapy, maybe long-term treatment. Her mother saw me standing there and came into the hallway, closing the door behind her. Quote 154, she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. I whispered. The woman's eyes filled with tears. And this is what she gets. This is what finding you did to her. I didn't want this, I said, my voice breaking. I was going to call her. I just needed time. Well, now she needs time. Years of it, probably. To recover from whatever happened to her in those woods. She wiped her eyes roughly. The doctors think it was a bear or a mountain lion, that the fear triggered some kind of break. But she keeps saying it looked at her, that it knew who she was, that it was protecting something. My breath caught. Emma had understood on some level. She'd seen Sage and known somehow that this was about me, about Charlotte Webb, about secrets that needed protecting. I whispered. Quote 165. Quote 166. Emma's mother said coldly, "We're taking her home tomorrow, and I'm asking you, begging you to leave her alone. Don't try to contact her, don't try to explain. Just let her heal if she can. Let her forget she ever found you." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. I watched through the window one more time as Emma sat in her hospital bed, drawing the same figure over and over with shaking hands. Then I left. I drove to the forest, hiking to our clearing through gathering darkness. Sage was there, Cedar beside her. The moment she saw me, she made a distressed sound. She knew something was wrong, knew I was in pain. "You destroyed her," I said, my voice hollow. "My daughter, Emma. You terrified her so badly she can't function. She's broken, Sage, and I can't fix it. I can't explain. I can't make it right." Sage made sounds that bordered on frantic, gestures trying to explain, to apologize. She showed me watching Emma in town, seeing her show my photo to people, following her into the forest. She'd seen a threat, someone hunting for me, someone who could destroy everything we'd built. "She wasn't hunting me," I said, tears streaming down my face. "She was my child, trying to find her mother, and you did exactly what I taught you to do. You protected me. You drove away the danger. You saved Annie Cole's secret." I laughed bitterly. "Congratulations, you succeeded." Sage moved toward me, making that mournful sound, reaching out to offer comfort, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said. "I can't. Not right now." I looked at her, this being who'd been my family for 15 years, who I'd trusted with my deepest secret, who'd protected me with fierce devotion, and I understood something devastating. We'd both failed. She'd failed by being exactly what I'd made her. And I'd failed by making her that way. by teaching her that the world was dangerous, that Charlotte Webb had to stay hidden, that anyone searching was a threat. For 15 years, I'd trained her to be my guardian, and she'd been perfect at it. Too perfect, I whispered. Sage made a sound of pure anguish. Cedar moved closer to his mother, clearly frightened by the emotion in the clearing. I'd never seen Sage like this, never seen her so distressed. She touched her chest, then reached toward me, pleading, "Don't leave. Don't break our family." But our family had already broken. The moment Sage revealed herself to Emma, the moment she drove my daughter into psychological collapse, everything we'd built shattered, and I didn't know how to put it back together. I turned and walked away, leaving Sage and Cedar in the darkness. Behind me, I heard her make that mournful sound, the one that meant grief so deep there were no words for it. I'd heard her make that sound twice before, once when she told me about losing her first child, once when I told her about giving Lily away. Now she was making it again, because she'd lost me. Not to death or distance, but to the consequences of love twisted by fear, to protection that destroyed what it was trying to save. I went home and sat in my cabin, staring at Emma's phone number on the piece of paper she'd left me. A connection I'd never use, a relationship that would never happen. A second chance destroyed before it could even begin. That night, I understood the full cost of the life I'd built. I'd run from Charlotte Webb, created Annie Cole, hidden in the mountains for 15 years. I'd found family in the most impossible place, built trust with a being that shouldn't exist, and I'd taught her that hiding was survival, that exposure was death, that anyone searching for the truth was dangerous. And she'd believed me, had taken those lessons and applied them perfectly when my daughter came looking for the mother who'd abandoned her 17 years ago. Sage had protected me, and in doing so, she'd destroyed us both. Because now I had to live with knowing that my daughter was traumatized beyond repair, and she had to live with knowing that protecting me had hurt me more than any threat ever could. Trust. That's what it all came down to. I'd trusted Sage with my secret. She'd trusted me to know what needed protecting, and together we'd created something so powerful and so broken that it had consumed the one thing I wanted most in the world. I'm 61 years old now. It's been 24 years since Emma knocked on my door. I never saw her again, never tried to contact her, honoring her parents' wishes. I heard through small-town gossip that she recovered enough to go home, to finish college, to build a life. But she never came back to these mountains, and I don't blame her. I went back to see Sage eventually. Took me 6 months, but I couldn't stay away forever. She and Cedar are still there, still living in the shadows, still surviving. We rebuilt something, but it's different now, smaller, more careful. There's a grief between us that never quite heals, a knowledge that love isn't always enough, that good intentions can destroy as surely as malice. She still leaves me flowers on March 14th, Lily's birthday. Emma's birthday, the anniversary of the choice that defined everything that came after. And I still bring her apples and sit with her in silence, two mothers who lost their children in different ways, who tried to protect each other and failed in the worst way possible. Some secrets aren't meant to be kept. Some protection causes more harm than the threat it's defending against. And some trust, once broken by love itself, can never be fully repaired. That's what Sage and I learned. That's what we'll carry for the rest of our lives, the knowledge that we had something precious, something impossible, something beautiful, and that in trying to protect it, we destroyed the very thing we thought we were saving.